Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Hello again, everybody. It's Stuart Holbrook, The Curious Collector. Happy to be here with you on a Sunday morning in Tokyo. Yes, I'm in Tokyo, Japan. It's been quite 8 or 9 days since my last episode dropped, and I have been kind of roaming the world a little bit. I left Chicago, where I was talking to you the last time, and hopped a plane to Melbourne, Australia, and had to go see a large collection in the town of Bermagui. I guarantee you there's nobody here listening that's probably ever heard of Bermagui, Australia, but that's where I went. A 9-hour, pretty epic drive on the left, of course, up the highway, what they call the Prince's Highway, and to this little town of Bermagui. And I was astonished because I pulled into this town as a population of 2,000. It is right on the ocean. I mean, one of the most incredible dual horseshoe bays with beautiful breaking waves over rocks, an incredible dramatic sight, population of 2,000 people, no traffic lights in the town, and one little hotel called the Bermagui Beach Motel, which my favorite check-in I've ever had. There's a sign that says, "Go to the bar." I was like, okay, well, if you insist. And so I had to go to the bar and check into the hotel. And it was unbelievable in the sense of, here I am in this town of Bermagui. I'm looking at it. It reminded me a lot of kind of the Monterey Peninsula in California. Beautiful setting. The weather felt very similar, cool, crisp weather. But when the sun came out, it was just striking and felt very warm. But I looked at this and it was just astonishing to me that if this was in America, this town, no matter where it was in America, in this setting, there would be a bevy of $10 million homes and major expensive resort hotels and Michelin star restaurants and everybody clamoring to buy up condos and develop it. And it's empty. It's completely empty. I was talking to the collectors whose collection I packed up, and they're in their 80s now and have lived in Bermagui for quite a while. And they said, "Oh, please don't tell anybody. We're trying to keep it a secret here." And I guess I'm going to be ostracized by them for letting you all know that Bermagui is the place, and it is completely undiscovered. But it's as my friend in West Virginia always says, a long way from a loaf of bread. It is 9 hours to Melbourne and 7 hours to Sydney. So you're kind of right in between on the coast, and there's not much else around there. But if you want remote, beautiful, striking setting for 10% of the price of, I don't know, Monterey, this is your place. And there was this incredible YouTube video because I became fascinated by Bermagui and why it had not developed as of yet. And there's this YouTube video called, "Is Bermagui the Next Byron Bay?" Which Byron Bay is a place that really took off, I believe in Queensland, I'm not sure, I can't remember. And so they were basically going on in the same manner I was of why has this lovely little place never been discovered? And I remember I looked at the comments, and the very top comment, and buried in a few more in there, was people saying, "Oh, well, it's because, of course, you know, the asbestos mine is buried underneath the town." And I was like, an asbestos mine underneath the town? Old abandoned asbestos mine. So I asked the collectors the next day when I was back working with the packing, and they were laughing and they said, "Oh, that's what we tell everybody to keep everybody out." So I guess this is the technique and how they've kept Bermagui free of traffic lights, not a single one, and is one little street right down the main street that is literally on the ocean, and about 5 shops and a couple little cafes, and of course, the Bermagui Beach Hotel, where you check in at the bar. So if you ever are in that neck of the woods, definitely stop by Bermagui. I know you'll enjoy it and marvel as well as I did on the aspect of how it has just remained completely undiscovered. So, I'm thinking back to the old book I've always loved called Cadillac Jack, written by Larry McMurtry, who you may know of, one of my favorite writers who wrote the classic Lonesome Dove. Well, he wrote a book called Cadillac Jack that was about this traveling antique dealer who would go all over the country and make connections and find unique pieces and some of his adventures. And there was a quote in there that always stuck with me in Cadillac Jack saying, "You can find anything anywhere." And in our business, it's true. You can even find a beautiful collection and lovely collectors in Bermagui. So I left Bermagui, headed up to Sydney, quick meeting there, and then flew to Tokyo, where I just wrapped up yesterday another wonderful, small but beautiful high-end collection of incredible little dolls. They'll be coming up in the fall. And later today, heading back to the US of A and back into the regular domestic traveling with a collection in LA, one in Atlanta, then home, and then Norfolk, Virginia, where I will be on the podium again for our once a year. We have a huge crowd in the audience auction, and that is at the National UFDC Convention. If you are a last-minute person, you can still come to the UFDC Convention, sign up, I believe, it's not a problem, and join in all the festivities that week. I like to call it DollCon. It's going to be wild. You'll have about 1,000 people from around the world converging on the beautiful waterfront town of Norfolk. There'll be the Barry Art Museum, which I've talked about on so many previous podcasts. And even our producer, Tammy, who's sitting in the studio right now in Los Angeles and recording all of this, she will be there because many of you don't realize Tammy is actually a doll collector with a specialty in composition dolls and an extra specialty of great knowledge in the world of the F&B historical series dolls and the background of their development. And she's going to be giving a program there that I know is going to be really groundbreaking in its research that she's going to present and fascinating for collectors as a microcosm look into a particular doll that is kind of steeped in its own wonderful history. So I hope you can all come on by for the convention, and I'd love to see you there at the auction. And we're going to be offering in that sale the first of selections from the Gail Cook collection. And that's actually who I'm here to talk about today. And so, yes, this is in a way to get people who may be coming to that auction or engaging in the idea of Gail Cook's contributions and work and collecting over the years, a little background about her as a person, because you can't in the catalog just put everything, all of your thoughts about every single collector out there. You only have so much space. So the podcast is a wonderful opportunity here at The Curious Collector to kind of go into a deeper dive about particular unique collectors and their history in how they engage the hobby, their contributions, what they left us as a legacy within the collecting. And we can learn from that a lot of times. And I think this is a great opportunity for you. And as well, it helps for those of you coming to the auction to kind of connect a little bit more to the dolls because, as I always say, the stories are the essence of what you are obtaining here. And so having a story of Gail, I think, is an important part of the process of ownership and the transfer of these pieces from one to another. So let's talk about Gail Cook today and talk about her life in collecting and her legacy and her lessons that she has given us. First of all, I want to start this because everybody keeps calling and saying, oh my gosh, is Gail okay? Because there's not a person, I don't think, in the world who does not know who Gail Cook is. I mean, I have talked to collectors in Japan, Australia, throughout Europe, everywhere. And every single person, oh, Gail Cook, the great American collector. And indeed, she is absolutely a multi-generation, 40, 45-year absolute pioneer in the world of dolls and one of the very impactful figures. So as you can imagine, when we announced that we're selling the first part of Gail Cook's collection, their calls were coming in, is Gail okay? Is Gail okay? And yes, so let me start by saying Gail is fine. She is doing wonderful. She has just found herself spending more and more time in her home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, though you all know of her living in Dallas. She has a beautiful house in Jackson Hole. She's been spending a lot of her entire summers there and parts of the winter. Since her husband, Dan, passed away some years ago, Gail has been kind of phasing out of many, many years of collecting. And I think a lot of it was that it was something that she enjoyed and was encouraged by Dan over the years. And it just didn't feel the same. Everybody has different reasons. And we've talked about this in the past and why collectors stop collecting. Everybody has varying reasons for their movement on from the hobby. With Gail's, I think it was because it was a transitional point in life. She's in her 80s now, doing great health-wise, looks incredible, but she had really just not been as involved in the dolls over the past few years because it is a complex collection. Many of you have seen this collection over the years. In 2006, as a matter of fact, the convention, the UFDC convention, was in Dallas, and I actually produced a book for this moment called In Perspective, and it was a highlight, more of an art coffee table book with an introduction about Gail's life in collecting, and presented this at the convention where we had buses bringing all the convention attendees over in groups throughout the entire week. She lives in this incredible, very, very upscale residential area called Highland Park in Dallas. And I'll still remember all the buses pulling up to the front of that house and what the neighbors must have been thinking as all of these doll collectors were traipsing in to see Gail's remarkable collection. That's the kind of person she was. I mean, she just always opened the door for everyone and loved to share the dolls with people. And so I think it reached a point where there were a number of combined factors that led her a little bit away from this path into a next stage in her life, and recognizing as well that, as I said before, her collection presented complexities. And what are those complexities? Well, we'll talk about Gail's aspirations for the best of every category that she loved. I'm not talking just casual. I'm talking about some of the most remarkable dolls in history that have ever been offered, that have come into Gail's hands over these 45 years that she's been in the world of dolls. And with that, a collection of that nature is very, very difficult to present in a single legacy auction. So I've had long talks with Gail over the years that when she reaches a point, she needs to very much plan sort of a 5 to 7 year window that if she wants to be involved in this, that she approaches the idea of a gradual sale. So that is offering maybe every year 30, 40, 50 pieces from the collection rather than one big auction event and boom, there it is. I mean, we had already done the book, so many of her dolls were featured in that book already. It has served as a wonderful profile of her as the collector and what she collected. So we already had that element, and that's a lot of the draw, I know, for some collectors is to have all of their collection in one auction book that can serve as a memory to them of their pieces that they achieved over their lifespan and for their families as well. But in this particular case, it just was not possible, and we already had that other book. So we approached it with the idea of this 30 to 40 to 50 per year over 5 to 7 year period of doing the collection gradually, because you can't offer 10, 15, 20 dolls that are all above, and my gosh, there's probably more than that, all above $50,000 to $70,000 in one sale. There's only so much that people can handle all at once. So we decided to move this through in a gradual basis. And we have this first part coming up in Norfolk on July 20th, and that's 2025 in case you're listening to this podcast later on, long past. So who is Gail Cook? Now, I know everybody knows her name. Many people know her personally, have talked to her, and that's one of the beauties of Gail's personality in doll collecting, and that she was the most outgoing and eager to talk to other collectors person I've ever known in this world. I mean, she could have been a more introverted collector if she had chosen that path, but she was not. She was really outgoing. And as I mentioned before, always opened her home to everyone and would be at conventions and auctions and gladly talking to people. Gail, she was approachable, I guess would be the word that is right to define her. And I think that stems a lot from her Midwest upbringing, where she grew up in Nebraska and then later on in Texas, where she lived with her husband, Dan, who was a legendary, I don't know the exact terminology for what he did, but I guess an investment banker in Texas and part of that whole Dallas society over the years. But she never felt like she was that. She was just, if you saw her on the street and stopped to talk to her, you think she's just the most wonderful, kind, nice person you've ever met before. A kind of Gene Autry character. I've never heard anybody say a bad thing about Gail, and I've never heard Gail say a bad thing about anybody else. And so she's very, very beloved over the years because of that. So I'm telling you this because I think it's important to put into context who she is as a person before we talk about some of the lessons that she gave us. And she really is, in many ways, also an unlikely collector. And why I think she redefined doll collecting for many people over the generations. So I've known Gail since, I hate to say it, I was a teenager, growing up in this business and watching her and seeing how she collected in the early accumulator age of collecting that we've talked about before, so she started off, I believe, in the late 70s, really ramped up in the 80s and 90s and continued on from there. And so she's been through multiple generations of collectors and styles of collecting, and I think was one of the catalysts of influencing a whole new generation of collectors that we see today, the pragmatic age. Through her tendencies, through her particular approach to collecting, she influenced a lot of the changes coming out of that great accumulator time because she did things differently. She redefined things. She was a disruptor in many ways, I think, in that. And I use the word disruptor a lot, I know, in past podcasts. And I always try to interject that that's not a negative term. It's just meant to be somebody who comes in and does things completely differently from the norm and ends up reshaping an approach, in this case, collecting. If you walk into Gail Cook's house, I think this is the moment where you really begin to understand the uniqueness of her taste and her home and how it relates to dolls, because it's not at all what you would expect. You know, there's this stereotype, I guess, of collectors and collectors' homes, and there's this element of Victorian nostalgia, let's call it, of the 19th century that one might imagine that is the essence of their environment. When Gail, in fact, you walk in, it is one of the most unbelievable postmodern houses you have ever seen, completely minimal, with Donald Judd boxes on the wall, Helen Frankenthal paintings. I mean, this is a shrine to contemporary art, a shrine to modernism, and the most unlikely setting for one of the world's great doll collections you could ever imagine. And this shows, too, the idea that Gail's taste and her love of objects really extends through the ages, from the 18th century on into contemporary postmodernism and contemporary art. And then you could even go to her home in Jackson Hole and you have a beautiful, beautiful house that's very rustic in the mountain style. So she has many different tastes in this. So the dolls were just one part of all of her collections, but certainly a really important one that you would take an elevator downstairs to this gallery that she had built out with these fabulous cases, still has a minimal environment within the room. And there, the doors would open, the lights would come on, and you would see one of the most fabulous doll collections in the world, from French bébés to German characters to automatons to early Chinas and Parians. So I'm sorry, I have to say so-called Parians. Florence has instilled in me that I don't ever want to hear you use the term Parian unless you say so-called Parian beforehand. So there it is. So I'm keeping myself from being fired on next week. But anyway, there had never been a collection displayed in this manner before in history. So it's really fascinating. And I've always loved to, when we had those bus exhibits coming to her house that I was hosting there with the release of the book I did in her collection, it was so wonderful to watch people's reactions coming into that home and going down to the doll room, they were just in disbelief because they had imagined a doll collector's home as being more of the stereotyped one. And so this was a complete shock to many people to see this. And I thought it was fabulous. And it was really interesting. And I think it gave people a whole different perspective. So it is, I believe, in these past 45 years, the two things that Gail gave us in a capsule. She really redefined collecting in the age of the great accumulator. And she redefined, I think, as well, the image of the doll collector. And so this was Gail's overall contributions, I would say, that really shaped the current age of doll collecting and gave us a figure that we could be inspired by, and who helped teach new generations of collectors coming in over the past 25 years a way to collect that was different from the past and probably more pragmatic and probably more rewarding to the heart of a collector as well. So I want to go through some of these lessons of Gail, break them down a little more for you to understand what it is that she redefined for so many people, because she approached things. And that is one thing you will learn about Gail throughout this episode, is that Gail did things her way. And it was as simple as that. She did not really take on the direction of others as to what she should collect or how she should collect. She formed her own ideas through education, through experience, through knowledge, and took it in the direction that she felt was the best for her, that she wanted to achieve in this. And that is one thing that I will say, as kind as Gail is, as wonderful and warm and giving and conversational to so many people over the years, Gail is fiercely competitive. And this is a feature I think some of you who've ever bid against her at auctions or talked to her know, and competed against her at UFDC conventions in the competition room, which she loved to do. She had a competitiveness in her, a healthy competitiveness, that I think actually is good for doll collecting in many cases, and makes the hobby rewarding and teaches us both failures and victories in this that we learn from. And so Gail was the epitome of this, and I think is a part of the process of really kind of understanding her. So what are some of these lessons? What are some of these things that she brought out that I think really influenced this generation, as I said before? First of all, when Gail started off in collecting, she didn't just come in willy-nilly. She had the money, she had the drive, she had the passion, but she approached it in a very methodical manner. And I've noticed this with Gail over the years, that she is not only educating herself, or was not only educating herself in the beginning and forming a base of knowledge, but she was constantly updating herself on new research, trends, patterns, everything that was happening in the doll market. She was a voracious student of the subject of dolls right up until today. And with that, I think inspire collectors to see that part of the passion is learning the stories and learning and understanding the background of each of these pieces, not only to know what you have, but to study what you might want. And so this is what Gail did. Her library, I mean, it must have been every single doll book ever published, every article, every auction catalog you can imagine in her home. And she would routinely be taking these down, studying, cross-examining. A new auction would come up, and she would study every doll in that auction and relate it to other research she had, auction catalogs, all of this. It was part of the fun, I think, for her as well. Part of the enjoyment, she would study the costumes. And we'll talk about Gail's really early on focus on originality with dolls, and how that was at an age when originality was not quite as big a thing in the late 70s and 80s. And so she really, I think, inspired a whole new generation of collectors to really understand the complexities of doll costumes, understand what is original, what is not, what you might want for your collecting. So all of this really wrapped up into this beautiful process that Gail gave us, in that if you learn about something beforehand, not only will you buy better later, but you might find categories that you really want to buy now that you didn't even know about. So that was the first thing, and the thing I've always noticed. I think about Gail, And if any of you have ever come to the auctions, Gail kind of had her one seat, and that was Gail's seat. It was the second row on the aisle, coincidentally right across from Fran and Chuck, who always sat on the second row on the right side. Those were their permanent assigned seats. And Gail would sit in that seat. Everybody else would get tired after a while, go for a walk, maybe go outside in the hall and talk to other collectors. Gail would sit in that seat for 9 to 10 hours, glued to it. Catalog open, pen in hand, writing down pricing, writing down notes, watching the trends of bidding for each thing, and absolutely was a documenter of the entire auction. If I ever needed to go back and look at something and know what it brought and how the interest was, I could just ask Gail. She had all the notes in every catalog. She was incredible in this sense. And she was doing it more for herself and so that she could become a better collector. And this is, I think, one of the gifts she gave us over this time. It's interesting. She came about in the age of the price guide collectors. And I've talked about this in previous podcasts. And that was the age and period in those 70s, 80s, and 90s that the entire audience would be sitting there and it would be a sea of blue, everybody holding their blue book. And their entire approach, let's just say, to how much they should pay for a doll within their idea of collecting was based on what the book told them it was worth. And that's one of the things that I remember about Gail, as incredibly studious as she was to the subject of dolls. She was not a price guide reader. She was not a price guide carrier. She really didn't pay any attention to price guides. She might have had a few over the years and kind of glanced at them, but they didn't define her approach. They didn't define how much she paid for a doll. Gail was one of the early enablers of collecting through the idea of when you see a doll that you have dreamed of, that doll comes up that you may never be able to get again. It is absolutely one with presence, costume, all the elements there. How much do you pay for it? Whatever it takes within your budget. So that was Gail's approach, and that was built upon her confidence that she gained through the study of dolls over the years. So she never, ever used a price guide in that sense. So that was not the area of research she was really looking at. She was more wanting to understand the background of every doll ever made out there to see how it fit within her context of collecting and to see whether it was something she really strived for. And then when it did come up, she would just go for it. Which leads us into an interesting area that I've noticed about Gail over the years, and that she has never been lured into trends in collecting. And I think a lot of this does stem from the education standpoint of what she has learned over the years, taking it more as a student of the history of dolls. And while she's paid attention, yes, to trends and activity and bidding and pricing, it's never really influenced her. And I take, for example, small dolls. Gail has kind of crossed the generational shift where collectors were buying larger dolls in the 80s and 90s, and that tended to be where the market lifted upwards, no pun intended. And then the shift in the 2000s, and especially in the last 10 years, of collectors being more passionate now, I would say, about small dolls, especially that 12-inch and under palm of your hand size, which is all the trend. And that's just one example. I'm not picking on that in particular, but one example of how Gail never really fell into that trending moment where she then said, okay, well, everybody's buying small dolls. Now I should buy small dolls too. She pretty much stuck to her vision in collecting. And what was interesting with Gail's collection is that she always would look for the largest potential size of a particular model that she was after that would obviously fit within her case. It couldn't be bigger than the height of her case, which I think was like 34 inches was the maximum size. There may be 35 that she could put into that case. So it had to still fit in there. So she wasn't going after 40-inch dolls, I can tell you that. A lot of times she would have, say, a 25-inch model or a 22-inch model, and then suddenly a 27-inch model would come onto the market. And if it was beautifully costumed, really great presence, and she felt it was a better example than the one she had, she would go after that and then replace it. So that was it's sort of a sideline lesson she gave us in upgrading your collection and staying true to your vision as well. And she didn't get involved into trending patterns. She stuck to her absolute focus, find the best example of every model she strove for, and take it from there and upgrade if you have to get that. Now, I'm not saying that collectors can't be flexible, that you need to write down your mantra of collecting and stand firm to it over the years. Everybody might shift and change as their lives change, their homes change, their interests change. They might move into something that is more trending right now. But Gail did that to a sense, but she didn't do it for the sake of trends. She did it simply because it was something she became more interested in and wanted a few examples of. So I think this is a really important one to unpack in understanding Gail Cook as a collector and some of these lessons. So the next one, Gail was, and I don't mean to speak in the past tense. Gail is, as I said, is fine. I'm speaking more in the past tense of her heyday of really active collecting. And so let's say Gail is very pragmatic. She is one of the most pragmatic collectors I have ever known over the years. Now, what is interesting is she came out of the age of the great accumulators. So these were the collectors who just bought everything they could find. They would fill their homes with $3,000 in many cases. They were the accumulators. They were all the Depression era collectors who grew up during that time, had little, and were revenge collecting in their later years. So there wasn't a whole lot of pragmatism in the idea of how they would approach their collecting. It was just buy whatever they could find and fill their houses every nook and cranny. Gail was the antithesis of this, and at a time when there were not many people like her. She was very focused, very pragmatic, and very patient. She was not looking to build a collection of $3,000. She was not looking to fill every nook and cranny of her house. She was looking to find the best of particular categories that interested her and waiting patiently for them when they came. But what does this mean to be pragmatic in your collecting? And I should say as well that Gail really, I think, was one of the major figures that shifted a lot of new generations of collectors to be very similar in their approach. So a lot of you may find this to be very familiar and say, well, that's what I do. But understand what I'm saying is Gail came out of an age when it was not a normal thing. And I think she helped shape collecting to understand a bit more about how you should collect and approach buying dolls for yourself in that, A, you don't want 3,000, and B, you don't want price guides. And I think that sums up the element of what pragmatic means in this sense. I always believe that Gail has, over the years, utilized a formula that even she doesn't know. It's just ingrained in her. She can't sit there and tell you, oh, well, I go through these 7 steps, for example. It's just built upon years of study and research in both the market and particular dolls that help her formulate a plan at every auction. And that plan could be, okay, this is a doll I'm never going to see again. This is a doll that I must buy this one because the odds of my finding it again, an example like this, I've waited 30 years for it, are slim to none. So I'm going for it. I don't care what perceived value is. I don't care what people tell me it may be worth. I am buying that doll. But then she would have different levels, I think, within the critiquing of a particular piece to know that maybe there are some that she'll go for. There will be an element of a certain amount of aggressiveness, but she's not going to go all the way on it because she may know and understand through her research that another one will potentially come up. So there's a misperception out there in the doll collecting world that I've heard so many collectors say this in the past, and the defeatist approach of auction bidders and collectors who they say, oh, I was bidding on it, and then I saw Gail bidding, and I just said, well, that's it, forget it, I give up. And I think this was an incredible tactic that Gail had in building this persona, and people thought there was no limit, when in fact, I have witnessed Gail approaching her bidding with a different level and formula for each doll. And there are some, I agree, that collector probably stood no chance. But there are many that collector did have a chance, and if they had just pushed a little bit more, would have probably gotten the doll. So it's an interesting approach in how Gail, through her pragmatic formulations of this, would also influence other people. And she probably got a few things just out of that, let's call it halo effect of thinking, Gail is bidding, that's it, I have no chance, I'm done. And so when a couple of extra bids may have done it. So remember that it's a good lesson because there are always major figures out there that people become obsessed on that think that there's no chance if they're bidding against that person. I have never seen any collector out there, period, stop right there, that have been unbeatable at an auction, that literally say, no limit. Okay, one, maybe Huguette Clark, because her orders were always buy the doll, no matter what. So there was one, but let's say that was an anomaly, and one person in the last 55 years of Theriault who had a specific order to buy the doll at any price. So there is nobody out there that doesn't have a stopping point. And so keep that in mind as you're bidding, that just go to the level that you're comfortable with. Keep moving up to where you are willing to pay for that doll. If you get it, great. If you don't, you don't. But don't just assume the other person is unstoppable. So I think Gail's pragmatic approach to this was very influential into this generation, because now you never see people using price guides. You see people far more educated as to the marketplace. And a lot of that has come from the internet being far more accessible to this, which in turn gives people a really on-the-fly, updated level of knowledge that Gail was doing back in the 80s, when I guess what I'm trying to say is back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I always felt like collectors, they formulated their education, they figured out what dolls were what, and they kind of stuck with that through their whole collecting life. They didn't really evolve much after that. So now today, Gail showed people back then and led to this age where the internet made it more accessible, that there is a constant upgrading of your knowledge, a constant shifting of learning about new things or updated research that might open new doors. And so I think this was an important contribution as well. Here's the other fascinating thing, that when you talk to people about Gail's collection, they perceive Gail's collection as being massive in numbers. And the reality being that Gail collected, as I said, in this time period where $3,000 in a house was commonplace. And she never, I think at the peak of her collection, at one point she had, and this may have been in the early 2000s, she had about $300. And that was the peak of her collection. And she would shift and change certain things in her collection over the years as well. And so her collection actually became smaller over time and might number now more along the lines of 250 pieces in total. So people are always so surprised when I tell them, well, I just imagined she had thousands of dolls. I can't believe that. Are you sure? And I'm like, I'm sure. I've worked on this collection for years with her, and I'm very, very cognizant of the number of dolls she has, and people are shocked. So she also, I think, allowed an understanding that it's not about the quantity of dolls that you have, it's about the quality of the dolls that you have. And I think this is an important one to touch on too, almost as a separate category, but falls within the pragmatic aspect, in that you don't need to have $2,000 like the old accumulator age, that you can still build a great branded, well-known, internationally renowned collection that might be $100, $150, or in Gail's case, $200 to $300. And it's okay. It's what you collect. And the perception will be, if you have the best within your category, people will actually think that your collection is a lot bigger than it is. And I noticed this phenomena the first with Gail's collection. And it's not about the number of pieces you have. It's about the cohesiveness of the quality that you have that will give the perception of people thinking, wow, that's a big collection. It is. It's a big collection of the best. And so Gail gave us this within this pragmatic approach to collecting. You know, Gail, and this is the next point that I think, the next lesson that Gail has given us over these years, is that she taught us that building your brand as a collector, and I've talked about this before, can lead to a lot of doors opening over time and lead you to being able to build a better collection. Now, I've always, though I've mentioned it, always said, collectors get confused when I say, well, what do you mean building a brand? I'm not Apple or Amazon. And I'm not saying that, obviously. And I'm not saying you have to build a business in dolls. But you can build a persona. You can build a level of awareness through the collecting circles, especially with the internet now and the ability to communicate across the world. Your passion and sharing your collection, sharing what you're after, and become noted for particular categories of things, particular types of dolls, or a particular aggressiveness in after really great, rare pieces. And this can open doors. And so Gail, I would say over the years, achieved a lot of the dolls that she was able to add to her collection. Achieve these not only because she was kind of intimidating when you were bidding against her at the auction, as I've mentioned before, and that was part of the brand that sort of came along with her, and which I don't think she built, but it just happened to be there. But more so, she would be contacted constantly by different dealers and other collectors who wanted to have that prominence of something going into the Gail Cook collection, and also realize that Gail might be the best right away option for selling that particular item to her directly. And so she would get offered things all the time. I mean, Gail would tell me stories of constant calls coming in every week from different people around the world. I have this to sell. I have this to sell. And that is an interesting takeaway as well within understanding the lessons of Gail. For a lot of collectors, that can be actually kind of intimidating. You feel like that person has called you. They're telling me, oh, this is so great for your collection, what I have. You would really love this piece, blah, blah, blah. They're telling you what you need. Gail never let anyone tell her what she needed in her collection. She made the decision whether she needed it or not. And this is an important lesson for all collectors in learning how to say no. I think some of you may relate to this. You feel this pressure kind of if it's a well-known person, even if it's me calling and saying, look, I think this would be a fantastic item to have for your collection. I'm really hoping you'll give it a shot and bid on this at the auction. Hey, you can take it with a grain of salt. If it appeals to you, know that it came with a recommendation. But if it doesn't appeal to you, just come right out and say, no, it doesn't strike me. I can see where you might like it or think it's important, but it just doesn't speak to me. And so that led to her being far more patient in her collecting. She just didn't buy whatever was offered. She was very, very tactful, pragmatic, as I mentioned, in saying, waiting, and not being lured into every single thing that was ever offered to her. Because she had built that brand, she had so much offered to her over the years. But because of building that brand, she had, let's call it first dibs. She had built the brand so big, so powerful, so noted that there was almost a first rite of passage, a first dibs for many, many years, especially in the 80s and 90s. In you got something big, you call Gail first. And that's a important and powerful tool for a collector who really wants to achieve great things. So next up on this unpacking of the lessons of Gail, she showed us what I have talked about in the past in the episode of collecting and marriages. And she showed us an interesting approach to involving your spouse into the collecting world and into your particular passion for collecting. And I use Gail in this episode, which I think is about 3 or 4 episodes back, in showing how it can have a very positive transformational moment within your collecting, in that it allows for validation and it allows for your spouse to give you confidence to push harder for the best things. So interestingly enough, Gail's husband, Dan, actually kind of got her started in collecting. He randomly, this is a recurring theme I've seen across the world with so many collectors out there, that it was their husbands that started it, never realizing that buying them one antique doll as a present was something that would lead to this long-term passion and millions of dollars later. It happened with Chuck and Fran Sorolla that I've talked about, and people don't realize or don't really know the backstory. It happened with Gail as well. It was Dan Cook that bought Gail randomly as a gift one day, an antique doll that he saw. And that started Gail's curiosity in the whole subject and began this passion of collecting. But I don't imagine, though, Dan really thought that this would turn into what became one of the great collections of the world over the past 45 years. And so it was at first, I think, a little bit of a struggle for him to embrace the idea. I think he was supportive right from the beginning, but his support really ramped up when Gail found a technique in which to involve Dan. And I've suggested this to so many collectors as of late as a way to involve your spouse, make your collecting more rewarding, have validation, and be able to go for the best. And that is, she found something within doll collecting that Dan could appreciate and understand within his own collecting, because he was a collector as well. He was passionate about watches and had a beautiful collection of incredible fine watches. As a matter of fact, Gail and Dan would travel to Switzerland on occasion to visit watch factories. And so this was a really tangible connection that she could find into dolls. And what was that? Automatons. Automatons are clockwork mechanisms. In many cases, share similarities in the technology. And many of the automatons were developed out of clockwork technology of the 19th century. So Dan became really interested in this, and as such began with Gail adding automaton selections to the collection, which then extended to his better understanding of portrait faces, the different models and types of characters and bébés that Gail would be looking for in her collection to build on. And he became far more supportive. As a matter of fact, there was a transitional moment, I think, when I loved having Dan at the auction, because I mentioned before how pragmatic Gail is and that she had limits to certain particular pieces that she was bidding on. But Dan was the consummate, perfect bidder at an auction. When his wife wanted something, that was it. He would just go for it. And he would take over the bidding and have a blast doing it. He loved it. Sometimes to the horror of Gail, I think, on a few occasions. But overall, he was so supportive in this. And he became really kind of a part of the collection for her, which I think, to be candid, to go kind of into a deeper, more personal look on the transition of Gail as a collector over the past few years. When Dan passed away, I think that was a shifting moment and maybe something, another lesson, a side lesson for a lot of collectors to know that one of the things and why collecting may change for you, become less of a passion, is because you did share it with your spouse and it became such an integral part of your relationship, the adventures you had, the auctions, the shows, the friendships you made. And when that spouse passes away, collecting may take on a new meaning, a new moment. And I think for Gail, this may have influenced a lot of the changes in her in wanting to see it, mixed with many things. It wasn't the only thing, in seeing this process of her collection gradually being offered at auction over the next few years. So get your spouse into the collecting just like Gail did. And I think she was one of the first. And again, she was doing this and did this at an age when the partners didn't really come to auctions or come to shows with their collector spouse. They didn't really engage in it. They didn't quite understand it, nor did they want to. And Gail, I think, gave a path for a lot of people in seeing how this can be positive. Rather than separating that person from your passion in life, bring them in, find something to connect with them. And Gail was one of the very first to do this. And now you see it as a far more commonplace thing with collectors, in that you have a team now. And it can be family members, spouses, whatever. And it enables a far more fabulous experience in this, in sharing it with somebody, and gives you more confidence to build and buy better things. Gail, I believe, without Dan's support that she managed to achieve in this collecting, would never have gotten as many of the fabulous dolls she had. They were a team. She would have built a great collection, but I think it went one step above because she found a way to include Dan in this and his respect in the process. So a really great lesson that I think Gail has given to the doll world. The next one, this is one of my favorite little lessons from Gail over these years, and I think influenced and changed a lot of the perspectives of collectors, because you see it far more now than you ever did back in the day. And I think Gail led this transformation, and that is, buy the dress now, find the doll later. Now, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s even, you didn't really see that very often. People looked at a doll, They bought that doll, and they bought it because they liked the costume that was on it, and that was kind of it. But Gail had a two-pronged approach to this. One, she didn't mind buying a really rare doll that was not on a great costume if she felt she could replace that costume. And this is an interesting thing. People who have not spent a lot of time with Gail don't realize how much time she spent costuming, working on costumes, sewing. She had a whole little studio off to the back of her doll room that she could not only had her library there, but to have all of her supplies so that she would work on the dolls. And she was the first to really explain to me how important this process is for any collector. People always thought, oh, Gail bought this fabulous doll, she put it in her gallery, and that was it. No, she was constantly evolving a piece in the sense of maintaining the costumes, sewing for it, preserving different things. An example, the A marks, we have one of them coming up in July in this particular auction from her collection. Many people look at that costume and they say, well, I don't remember her wearing that costume in the case. She wasn't. Gail had a different costume on it. Why? Because the costume that was on it, that she got it with, is an original Margane Lacroix. Very valuable, very historically important, very delicate. And so she wanted to assure that that costume was really well preserved. So she removed that costume and put it in a special archival preservation area she had for textiles and kept it there for this moment so that it can convey to the next collector who will be able to have it in as pristine condition as when she got it. So Gail was always working with the costumes in this particular manner. And I think as well gave us the concept too that sometimes you see this incredible, fantastic outfit out there, costume, and you maybe do not have a doll right now for that costume, but that costume is so incredible. Why not buy it, keep it, and one day you may find the doll in a not so great costume, but the doll itself is fabulous, and you can put that costume on it. Perfectly fine. And I think Gail gave us that vision and that approach in buying that dress now, find the doll later, and why she has drawers of different doll costumes and shoes and bonnets. And it could extend to all the little bits and bobs too, even wigs, and always looking to upgrade her particular doll in presence, in having all the elements that are important to make it really striking and really special. The last lesson, I think, is one that is really far more important than collectors give it in their context of building a great collection, one that they can be proud of and one that they can show to legions of others. Gail was able to present her doll collection to a lot of really interesting people, museum executives, artists, diplomats, all the people that would visit the Cook home would go on a tour of this gallery of dolls, and they would see dolls in a very unique and different perspective. It was more a museum, and it was presented in a sense of being like a museum. Gail was not a vignette type of person. She was more of a minimalist by nature that happened to extend a love of this particular age and golden age of doll making. But she was not one to make dolls interacting with others. She liked to have her dolls displayed in a sense of the way a museum would, focused on that one particular doll in this setting, which was very stark, minimal, black background, beautifully lit room, but not overwhelming, more like a museum. And as such, she would welcome a lot of the others, as we call it routinely now, to this. And they would see dolls in a unique perspective like this and have, I think, a gained appreciation. She would have, in that gallery, she would also schedule a lot of time. She had different clubs that she belonged to in Dallas and Highland Park, the Ladies Antique Collector Club of Highland Park, who I spoke to one time about the history of dolls and helping them understand through Gail's collection the importance of this. Investor groups would come and have meetings in that doll room surrounded by the dolls, as you could imagine. It was quite interesting. So what the lesson in this is that display matters. How you display your dolls, whether you like vignettes, and that's perfectly acceptable and obviously a very big trend right now, or whether you like minimal approaches, the way you display within the context of that idea is so vitally important to people's perception of the collection and ability to see it in a way that they can potentially relate to. So I am always encouraging collectors, and a lot of people say, well, I don't want to spend a lot of money on display and cases because that just takes away from my doll money. Well, I think Gail gave us the lesson of how important it is. Now, I realize other people may have budgetary concerns or lack of space to build out something dramatic, but try to do the best you can within your display to give your collection more value in the eyes of others. Doll collectors may come in and you could put them in a Costco case, and if it's a fabulous brew, they're going to identify and relate to it. But if it's the others, and you want to build up a validation in their mind of respecting and seeing beyond the idea of just a doll, you got to have display. And Gail was, I think, the very first collector out there who showed collectors that it does matter. It really matters how you display them, how the dolls are presented, the room they're in, the lighting is really important. All of these factors, and influenced and inspired a whole new generation of collectors, because now you see people paying a lot more attention to the presentation of the doll in their home and not just cramming them in a case. I always feel bad for those dolls that are in the back of the cases with 2 layers of dolls in front, because they're kind of forgotten. I was packing a collection recently that this was the situation here, and I was pulling the dolls out, and as we got to the back layer, they're like, oh, I forgot about all those. I haven't seen those in years. So even you can't appreciate your collection all that well in its entirety if you don't pay attention to display. And I think display and how Gail inspired this new generation and new idea is one of the greatest contributions she ever gave us. So I end it with just saying, Gail was that first collector I ever met that really embodied the you do you idea of collecting. She was courageous, and she is courageous, and is one of the most pragmatic and approachable people out there. She learned to be competitive, but kind within the process. So she built a brand, but everybody loved her regardless, no matter if Gail beat her. As a matter of fact, I know collectors say, oh, I was bidding on it, but Gail got it. And if I had to lose it, I'm glad I lost it to Gail. So it's kind of a remarkable thing, but I heard that so often over the years because she was so beloved and so respected in the world of dolls with her contributions at UFDC conventions, the exhibits she would do. This is a woman who didn't have to do this. As I said before, she could have chosen a path of being an introverted collector, a more private collector, and had that right to do it, but she gave so much. I remember times when Gail would load up her SUV and drive 700 miles to a convention to be able to exhibit her dolls for a special exhibit that UFDC was having at that particular convention. This is the type of person she was. She was giving, sharing, and still is in many ways in her collecting, and still approachable and still out there and still willing to talk to collectors, even though she's entered this new transition in her life and in her collecting. And she's given so many people the most valuable and fabulous lessons, and I think shaped an entire generation out there in following Gail's footsteps. Be like Gail, but you do you. And we've taken little snippets of parts of things that Gail has brought to the world of collecting, and did it in a time where you had to be courageous to do it. There were ways of doing things back when Gail started, and she said, no, I'm going to do what I want to do. And this has led to this new generation of collecting that is following in her footsteps, guided by a whole new perspective and light, I should say, of how to approach collecting. And as such, one of the most inspiring and integral figures that I believe will be generational in a name, will be remembered 100 years from now as being one of the great collectors of doll history.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media, and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault, or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.